This is Reynolds Podcast, The Creative Mindset.
Hi everyone, welcome to The Creative Mindset, a podcast about what the future holds at the intersection of creativity and technology. I'm Ray Nomoto, the founding partner of I&Co, a global innovation firm based in New York and Tokyo. Continuing from the last episode, today's guest is Kevin Bethune, the author of the best-selling book Reimagining Design and founder and chief creative officer of Dreams, Design, and Life, a think tank that delivers design and innovation services using an empathic, holistic approach. If you haven't listened to part one of this conversation where we talked about how Kevin built an illustrious career spanning engineering, business, consulting, and design. In part two of this conversation, I asked Kevin a personal question. What were the challenges as a minority, a Black individual in academic and corporate America? So let's get started. Something that I sympathized very deeply in your book is this idea of, as you wrote in your book, feeling like the other. I knew that phrase, obviously, but I don't, and the word minority, being Black, being Asian, being someone else, not fitting in, what have you. But I really appreciated this articulation. This book is for anybody who ever felt like the other. Because I don't think I've come across that articulation, that expression, such a simple expression. But many of us, especially people who are from somewhere else, geographically, ethnically, what have you. So I really deeply sympathize with that point. But I wanted to get specific in terms of, say, situations, episodes, experiences that you've had, and I'm sure you've had many, but to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing, what being a person of color, a Black person, and Black engineer or a designer or a professional in general, and the context in which you worked, an engineering company, the very first one, and you went to MBA, and you went to an athletic company, which I've been to that campus. There isn't a lot of color, at least back then, like 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of color, I have to say. Their athletes, top athletes that are represented might have a lot of color, but not on campus, I'm sorry to say, let's say. And then consulting, there isn't a lot of color either. Yeah, you have been feeling like the other throughout your career. So if I may, what is and what was the hardest thing about feeling like the other?
There's been a few moments, standout moments. Maybe I'll first focus on my experience and then in terms of what I observe in others being othered. At least when I went through my engineering chapter, it's pretty like nuts and bolts, not to be cliche around mechanical engineering to speak, but it was very like black and white. Success looked like this, your ability to get the job done or not. So it was pretty clear what the success criteria was. So even if I encountered resistance, which I did, where people might have doubted how I showed up or doubted my potential, but as long as I could get the work done, I won respect, even from people that gave me initial ignorance or resistance. I won respect pretty quickly by just the sheer nature of the work. When I got into the Nike environment, it was probably the most difficult because it was less black and white. How you navigated such a matrix, such a complex matrix of different departments and geographies and categories, and the politics, the political capital required to navigate across that spectrum of business areas could not be understated. And so I wasn't born at Nike. My career didn't start at Nike. But when I'm in a situation where I'm side hustling to learn as much as I can, I'm working a second job, working for free for myself to learn and show that I can create this evidence, that I have potential to at least understand what to do in certain arenas. And when I'm holding up evidence and I'm applying for the next job, hopefully trying to get closer to design and innovation, and I'm being told it's cute what you're doing on the side, cute. But what you did at Nike before this doesn't matter because this place is hard. And granted, they're talking to someone that has a nuclear background and the most mission critical of product execution there is. You're telling that person that what they did prior to Nike doesn't matter. And the last thing I'll say is what they told me is that if it's between you and someone that started their career and they've been here for 10, 15 years prior, we're going to pick that person every time. So really, there's no place we see for you.
Was it purely based on your professional background? Or do you think there was a degree of skepticism because of the color of your skin?
You can never definitively point to the evidence of exactly that. But in the absence of constructive critique, when you don't give me a clear sense of what the bar is, and I'm trying to hit the bar by the side hustle that I'm doing, I'm holding up product. And I really appreciate those creative mentors that I met that were brutally honest about what I didn't have yet as skills. They showed me the portfolios. They showed me like where you need to go to get the right type of learning. I appreciated that so much. Yes, it was hard to hear like the gaps that I don't have yet, but I appreciated the respect that they had for me to be honest with what the success criteria is. But when I encounter folks that are just like, we don't see you doing that, and there's not a clear why, and they're not able to unpack for me like the clear bar of success or the road of what it takes, it's just, we don't see you doing this. So like we're never going to pick you. It makes me wonder, where is that motivation to resist coming from?
Yeah.
When I look at their teams and I see none of me, and they're claiming to serve the athlete over here, which in many cases are predominantly Black and brown folks.
Yeah.
And I look in the team and there's zero culture reflected in that team and their ability to serve Black and brown folks, and they're gatekeeping me from the opportunity.
So what they say, but also what they don't say,
speaks volumes.
Do you think, and I'm not necessarily, because I've worked with Nike for a long time and I have a lot to thank for who I am today partially because of my experience with Nike. I never worked at Nike, but I worked pretty closely with Nike. So I definitely have a lot of respect and appreciation for the organization. And taking the conversation slightly away from Nike, but just in corporate America in general, that sense of either the lack of inclusion or either conscious or unconscious exclusion of certain folks like you or me, let's say. But do you think that underlying nuances of bias towards individuals, do you think that's changed, that's gotten better, that hasn't changed, or even worse?
Growing up in a household of two working parents, you learn from your elders that these patterns have existed before. And watching my dad's career, for example, play out, he worked with the same employer for over 30 years. And he warned his kids, there's a pendulum, and he is so right. There's a pendulum of concern for mitigating bias and championing inclusion, and then it swings the other way against any idea of reimagining or altering the existing power structure. And I think we're in a climate right now, like the pendulum was the other way a few years ago with the summer of the unfortunate murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the like. A couple of years later, you don't hear any companies really talking about social equity and inclusion anymore.
Even in his generation, he saw that pendulum swing this way, every company talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, what have you. And then a few or 5 or even decades later, nobody's talking about it.
Back and forth.
I've been in this country for now over 25 years.
Yep.
And I downplayed my minority card. And I also didn't have to think as much about my ethnicity and my origin story as much as I do now. Yeah, I think about it, the fact that I'm Japanese, that I'm Asian, way more in the past 5 to say 10 years. And the tipping point for me, and not to make this conversation about politics, but was 2016, like Obama to Trump.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then, by the way, like, I don't think that was like clear cutoff. I think it was gradual from 2016 on. And by, say, like you said, the summer of 2020, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, that was like the real tipping point.
And the rise of Asian American Pacific Islander hate crime.
Exactly. I never had to be aware of my ethnicity as much as I do now, and as much as I had to since 2020-ish. But it started, I think, around in 2015 or 2016, precisely. What do you observe?
Unfortunately, I think for Black Americans, 2020 and the spike of awareness was not a surprise to us, because within our circles, within our communities, there are always these kind of stories that don't get reported. They don't get, before even the rise of social media, like we knew of these stories happening. I could tell you stories from my own family where we had egregious assaults on our property or on our person. Overt stuff, not just covert resistance, overt. And so many of these stories have not been told from a Black community perspective. So that when 2020 came around, the world was finding out what Black people have been saying all along and weren't necessarily believed. And from a covert angle within spaces where we spend a lot of time, the workplace, corporate America, the global enterprises, what have you, all of a sudden people were waking up to the idea of, wow, my sea level is not reflective of society. There's like very minimal Black and brown folks. Our boards, lack of Black and brown folks. And unfortunately for my Asian brothers and sisters, the paradigms of model minority tension, and they'll come to bear where some of our demographics are played off of each other under largely white supremacist sort of systemic inequity and motivations and agendas. And again, any talk of disrupting the power structure it's being met with overt resistance right now.
Just to look for some lights in this darkness, so to speak, were there advantages of being or feeling like the other?
Yes, it's funny. The most diverse place I've ever worked was being a creative co-founder of what became BCG Digital Ventures.
Oh, no way.
And that, now granted, it was interesting and illuminating operating within the realm of prestigious BCG, our parent company, and these prestigious relationships.
Yeah.
But we were a bunch of makers trying to spark what we called innovation or incubation of new businesses. And so we were a ragtag group of misfits trying to make things, we were trying to build things. And we didn't pretend as an early team to have all the answers. So we were constantly canvassing the earth to find kindred entrepreneurial spirits that wanted to have the courage to jump into BCG's landscape and build with us. So after a while doing that, we didn't just go to the same schools that maybe our parent company were used to going to. We were canvassing the earth. I was finding kindred spirits on social media, using Twitter a lot during the time to find people that I felt could add to our toolkits, could add to our methodologies, could add to our capabilities.
Okay.
And after years of building, I look back and it's the most diverse place we've ever had.
Wow.
Because we looked on purpose for the best talent and we casted the net wider than what was typical.
So give me a couple of examples of these unexpected misfits. And what were the signals that you were looking for on social media or Twitter? What made you go, oh, this person looks interesting? What were the signals that you were looking for? Either consciously or subconsciously.
Yeah, I think both subconscious and consciously, like who is leading through making? Who is leading through how they engaged particular target audiences of potential consumer or people that our BCG's clients are serving, who already has credibility in that community or in that landscape already? And what are they doing that's new and novel? Whether it's techniques around decolonization or future scenario planning or capabilities that maybe we didn't have immediately in our coffer. You figure out, you follow the breadcrumb trails of thought leadership, of ingenuity in particular communities around the planet that we were ultimately going to serve one day because of BCG's expansive client roster. How do we find those people so that we're ready to be nimble and agile and flexible to pivot into those emerging opportunities?
Yeah. So when you say makers, can you be even more specific? And if you can't name names, then what were some of the individuals that you hired?
Like one, we found a gentleman that's very good at speculative design. And he was a design technologist, built things, prototypes, not just regular prototypes, design prototypes, but like speculative prototypes with Arduinos and open source componentry. But he manages that in a very creative way. Another former colleague who was originally from Japan, she was probably the most introverted person that you would ever meet, very soft-spoken. But when you watch her work in the field, the delicate tact of unpacking with people, their attitudes, motivations, inhibitions, they would spill the beans with her faster than any researcher I've ever witnessed.
So was she a researcher?
She was an architect by prior training,
Okay.
but got into design research and was very good at it, the best.
And did you find her through Twitter, or how did you find her?
So through just more communities that I was a part of, we were able to.
Oh, I see.
But again, another person who's a prominent futurist on the speaker circuit now with her work, I found her on Twitter, and she's engaged here and there in the ecosystem with BCG. So there's many examples.
Wow. And then eventually, how many people did you end up having in this ventures group?
So when I left, it was just a handful of us when we started. But after 7 years with that founding team, it was over 1,000 people by the time I left. And 1/3 of that was design.
So to dig deeper on that topic, another powerful quote that you had in the book was, "There's only one of you." And very simple statement, but I think a lot of times, even at our age and at my age, we forget that may be the greatest power that we have as individuals. Yeah. There are specific examples where this mindset that there's only one of me, that mindset became handy.
I think one of the things that I've observed and what makes a successful team over the years, especially one that's multidisciplinary and embarking upon an innovation journey to make something new and novel, we are more than just our titles. Like, I'm living proof of that. To bring my full lived experience to the party, it makes me hypersensitive to where people are being othered within the existing team, as well as the demographics that we're claiming to serve. I can be more sensitive to things that I don't understand and lean in closer. I've also seen the other side of that coin. For example, I was in a workshop a couple years ago. The room was a long room of 30 people around a long conference table, reflective of one particular demographic that was dominant. And what was rewarded in the room was very much alpha kind of sensibility of leadership, who had the loudest voice, got the influence, got the attention of everyone. But there was one woman in that room, a Black woman, and I got to know her on some of the coffee breaks of this workshop. And I realized, oh, wow, she's like super deep, and she's worked in some of the most incredible academic spaces. I want to say maybe she went through Stanford and some other place, a couple master's degrees, super credible experience prior to working at this place that she was in. And during the workshop, though, I noticed behind the table, her hand was shaking underneath the table, like trembling. But above the table surface, she was very stoic. And I recognized that from my own experience in prior chapters, where she was rehearsing in her mind what she was about to contribute. And don't you know, whenever she did speak up, it was very just in tune, relevant from her own lived experience and perspective, because the demographics of target audience we were talking about, she was representative. She was that person that we were talking about as the customer. But for her to speak up, I could feel the calories it took for her to interject and to get her voice in. And unfortunately, maybe a quarter of the room might have heard what she had to say. And it was the most thoughtful and intuitive and nuanced perspectives that she was offering. But to have a fourth of the room maybe listen to it, the 3/4 were doing sidebar chatter and almost pretending like she didn't speak. So the relevance, to watch her go through that pain, was very jarring for me. It seared into my memory. And so that's why I coach teams to bring your full self to every conversation.
Is it really up to the leader?
Yes, I think there's a huge responsibility for those charged with leadership, with the privilege of leading, to serve that team, to make it a safe environment for different ways to people to express themselves, to demonstrate leadership in different ways, not just the alpha archetype of the biggest voice, Allow that person to come in with a prototype. Allow that person to get up at the whiteboard and draw. Allow that person to interject maybe indirectly. Maybe they're not the dominant one that's going to speak first, but make room for that second and third person to have equal voice. Otherwise, the room might feel like it's on a particular alignment or on someone's agenda, but it might be isolated to just a few of the strongest voices.
Yeah. There are certain mental methods that you've developed to overcome in which you manage tricky, difficult situations, feeling like the other.
Yeah. What going through those experiences taught me is how can I, to the example you just gave of the CMO, how are my behaviors? Like, how can I take personal accountability in my leadership behaviors? Recognizing that leadership is a privilege, right? And we have the opportunity to serve. And so if I encounter resistance now, if it's a client partner or a stakeholder over here or there, it's like, what is my line of sight to who we're serving ultimately? Who is the business supposed to serve? And then in turn, like, how is the business serving the teammate's ability to serve that person? So there's a chain of almost critical path, empathy and care and service that's necessary to satiate everyone's values, everyone's value criteria. Anything is getting in the way of that. If someone's even directly opposing me and not explaining why and forcing me to wonder where their motivation is coming from, I'm always going to point to that sequence of critical path service that's required and say, like, how is this behavior intrusive to that? I'm always going to speak to having a solution orientation to, like, whatever it is we're talking about, how is it helping those people we're supposed to be serving? How are we helping our team feel empowered to do what it needs to do to serve those people? If what we're talking about is noise against that, then I'm going to ask that person who's opposing for evidence of why they're opposing. And if they're not able to give it, then it's a different conversation. I'm going to be very direct with that person. So if I'm always coming from a solution-oriented perspective, from a service orientation in terms of servant leadership behavior, it gives me a bit more like layers of protection. And also my team that are under my care, it gives everyone some levels of protection against unfounded opposition.
So it really comes down to asking constantly, who are we serving? And like you said, having a clear line of sight towards whom we serve. That's a really beautiful thought. So that was part 2 of my conversation with Kevin Bethune, the author of best-selling book Reimagining Design and founder and chief creative officer of Dreams, Design, and Life, a think tank that delivers design and innovation services using an empathic, holistic approach. In part 2 of this conversation, I asked Kevin a personal question. What were the challenges as a minority, a Black individual in academic and corporate America? When I read his book, I was immediately struck by the fact that he made a point about being a Black individual and Black designer and professional in this corporate America. Earlier in the book, in the opening, he writes, I want this book to speak to those who have felt like the other at any point in their journey. This quote really spoke to me because I felt exactly like this. I've been feeling like the other for a long, long time personally. Even before I came to this country, I grew up in Japan, but in a countryside in Japan. As my family was from Tokyo and we moved to that countryside when my brother and I were 2, because my dad moved us to that remote village because he wanted to start a company. But because we were the only family in this village from another, not just town, but from Tokyo, which was this gigantic cosmopolitan city, and this village was a remote mountain village in a little town called Hidatakayama, we were seen almost as a foreigner in Japan, even though we were Japanese. I then left Japan when I was 16, went to Switzerland, went to an international high school, came to the US when I was 18 to go to college at the University of Michigan, and then eventually moved to New York City after I graduated. But I've always felt from my early childhood like the other. So this phrase, I want this book to speak to those who have felt like the other at any point in their journey. I immediately felt seen and heard. At the end of the book, in the closing chapter of the book, he writes, "Someone may disagree with my opinions, but they cannot take away the experiences that have made me the person and professional that I am. Someone may disagree with my opinions, but they cannot take away the experiences that have made me the person and professional that I am." This was a simple but such a powerful statement because it can apply to anybody, and it is a true statement regardless of who you are and regardless of what you do. I can only imagine what kind of hardship he has experienced. I happen to have spoken to a bunch of minority creative practitioners throughout the course of this podcast, starting with somebody like Ian Spouter, a Black designer who's now based in Japan. He was the head of design at Instagram. He still works at Meta in Japan. To John Jay, one of my creative icons, mentors, and the industry legend, who also works in Japan, but also travels around the world to New York, to Europe, to all over the place. Dr. John Maeda, an early indirect mentor of mine in design and technology. To Greg Hochman, the former CMO of Nike. Tim Allen, the former head of design at Airbnb. And now Kevin Bethune, somebody who went from being an engineer early in his career to a business planner, to a consultant and a designer. And other folks like Paolo Antonelli, the senior curator of design at the Museum of Modern Art, who's originally from Italy, moved to the United States. A few other individuals that come to my mind, Judy Channing, who was the original CMO of Allbirds. What lies underneath the surface of these individuals is the quiet strength that they have. One trait that I've observed among these individuals, and particularly people like Kevin, who is Black, and I can only imagine, but also I cannot imagine what type of hardship that he and other Black individuals have had to go through to get to the level and the position that they are in currently. What is peculiar about these individuals is the way they do not talk about the hardship and challenges immediately. When I ask them specifically about these challenges, they do bring up certain episodes or moments, but they're not quick to use them as a badge of honor, so to speak, or the experiences that they had that was so difficult and, hey, look at me, how great I am overcoming those challenges. None of these individuals that I just mentioned use those hardships as a shield. Rather, they rarely mention them unless I ask them specifically. Another thing that I've noticed as a common theme is how they understand other people like them around them. I remember early on in my conversation with Ian Spouter, who's also Black, I worked with him. And he mentioned when he and I worked together almost 20 years ago that there was a Black boss above him, and how Ian appreciated having a person of color as his boss, and how this individual behaved and didn't let the fact that that he was a person of color as a detriment or disadvantage. Everybody knew him, this boss, for who he was and is. And there was something that Ian took away from this individual. Later on, when he was in a position to manage other people, he noticed a young Black designer struggling and empathized the hardship, either direct or indirect challenges that Ian experienced as a younger designer, being a Black designer, and not being recognized for the talent and skill. And he had to have hard evidence to be able to demonstrate his value as a designer. And that kind of episode, that kind of story is common among these individuals that I talked about. And in the case of Kevin as well, the challenges that he faced starting, I'm sure even before his college days, either directly or indirectly because Black. So that takes me to my inspiration to live by from Kevin Bethune today is the following. To have emotional intelligence, you have to know and understand your emotions first. To have emotional intelligence, know and understand your own emotions first. I appreciate the fact that all of these individuals, guests that I've had, and particularly people like Kevin, Greg, Ian, Tim, and quite a few others, they have this quiet strength in them, and they really understand what others who are like them, what those individuals are feeling like because they've gone through those situations themselves. So emotional intelligence is a word, is a term that have been preached quite often in the past decade or so, but behind it starts with you. To have emotional intelligence, you have to know and understand your emotions first. Today's inspiration to live by from Kevin Bethune is to have emotional intelligence, know and understand your emotions first. If you like our podcast, please follow us everywhere you are listening. And if you could leave us a 5-star rating, we'd be so grateful. If you have questions or comments, please send them via the link in the show note. I'm Ray Namoto, and this is The Creative Mindset. See you next time.